Welcome to Regulate Tech. This week, we'll be talking about something that is very timely and probably on most policy professionals' minds. What do you do with a new incoming government? Because there's plenty of them. We have the UK government, we have the European Commission now coming in, being declared as we record this episode. And of course, in November, there's a new US government coming in. So how should you think about the new governments coming in? Is it an opportunity? Is it something that is risky? Or is it actually just something that you should integrate into your everyday thinking, not just around elections, but in all the time that actually leads up to the elections as well? Well, we'll sort that out with me, Nicklas, Berild, Lundblad, and...
with me, Richard Allan.
So you must have been through several elections in many countries in your time as a policy lead for a large team. What do you think are some things that happened around elections that are interesting to think through and sort of plan for as a policy person?
I think it's really important that you characterize each election by its own dynamics, because there are elections where essentially the same team is carrying on. And you've really got quite a lot of continuity. And then there are elections that are going to be a major break. And I think we understand most of the time when we're looking at the election, which one of those it's going to be. And it's those major break elections in some ways that are the most interesting, because that's where you can really shift policy direction. The whole thing is really quite an odd process, isn't it? In any other organization where most of the organization carries on, most of the organization of government is thousands and thousands of people employed in any country to run government. But this sort of thin layer at the top gets turned over from time to time. So it's a very, very weird process. Imagine in a business where you turn up and go to work in a business one day and they go, well, the people have been running the business for the last 5 years. They've gone. We've got this complete new set of people who are just going to take over the business and run it. So I think understanding that dynamic, particularly when it's one of those all change moments, I think is really important.
So let's go through it in sort of a time scale fashion. Let's look at a year before the election, 3 months before the election, the week after the election, the month after the election. Let's use that as sort of a general idea. Now, in a year before the election, you want to be thinking about what the election will be about, right? So there are party conferences, things like that. You want to have an understanding of how the issues are going to be rendered in the election. What's the most effective way of doing that?
Yeah, I mean, what's very important is obviously in the run-up to election is what are the political commitments that each of the players is going to make, because those political commitments, they don't always bind politicians once they've been elected, but they give you a sort of strong sense of where they feel they ought to go, and if they depart from them too radically, they'll get criticised. So in that run-up in the year running up to the election, you're really looking at those commitments, and you are, I think, operating on multiple levels. This is always a game of three-dimensional chess, the Star Wars three-dimensional chess game that's happening.
Who's the Wookiee, I wonder? Anyway,
yeah, so because you've got, obviously, I say that the machinery of government is going to carry on. And actually, again, it'll vary from system to system, but certainly in the UK, that run up to the election, the machinery of government starts to behave differently, because they need to read, the civil servants, the professionals need to read the runes for what they think an incoming government is likely to do and prepare for all of those options. So you've got this phase where you've got the politicians developing their public commitments, and you've got the civil servants working up the options. So it's a really probably the most intense period that you ever get in a political cycle is that period in the run-up, because everyone wants to be able to push the button and go when they get in. I mean, politicians always talk about their first 100 days plan. That's the classic thing that politicians do. So they're spending the year in the run-up figuring out what it is they're going to do in the 3 months when they get into office. And most of them see those first 3 months as critical for their reputation and their subsequent re-election, however many years later, whether it's 4 or 5 years, whatever it is. There's this real high premium placed on what you do in that initial period. But you don't make that up on the day of the election. You're right, Nicklas. You've kind of thought about that a year before, and you've come up with plans, and you've written them up, and you've gone backwards and forwards to try and get something you can. It's got to be both ambitious and realistic. It's got to sound great and like a radical departure, but it's got to be realistic, which often means building on things that are already in process.
And it's a weird thing where that year running up to the election is both a season for sowing, sort of trying to find the seeds of what the new government will do, but also a season for reaping, because you want to make sure that whatever you promise to do in the first electoral cycle is actually really done. So for policy teams, typically I would say this is a really intense time when there's a lot of stuff that can happen very fast because people want to make sure that their track record is in order in front of the in advance of the election. And then of course there's this question of, as you rightly point out, what is the first 100 days going to look like and what flows from that first 100-day commitment. So you have to manage a little bit of both, right?
Exactly, and the people who are working on this, again, I think it's really important you look. There are two classes of people. There are the politicians, the ones who are standing for election, if it's an elected system or in something like the European Commission, they're I don't know how we describe that, but there's a selection process where they've got to go and put themselves out there. But behind them, there is a whole group of people who are going to come into government. Again, this layer, the thickness of the layer will vary from country to country. In the United States, there's a huge swathe of people that come into quite senior roles in the new administration. In the UK, it's quite thin. There's a few special advisors will get appointed. In something like the European Commission, we know that the cabinets, the personal teams of the commissioners will come in with them. So you've got this whole raft of technocrats, if we can describe it that way, people who are sort of policy experts who are not the ones standing for election, but they're the ones who are going to support the people who do get elected if they get elected. And I think in that period of time, it's really important to understand those two levels. You're speaking, in some senses, actually, the most important people to speak to are the technocrats, the ones who are going to be working for the politicians, because they're going to be the ones who come up with these detailed plans.
Yes, and we sometimes talk about the people who hold the pen, the people who sort of write the proposals or the reviews or the consultations, and they are a part of the sort of professional. We call them technocrats, but they're really good technocrats because without them, government wouldn't work. Government capability hinges on them being there and providing a sense of continuity, I think, and it's really important to address them. But they will then be circumscribed, of course, by the political mandate that the politicians have been given. So one of the things that happens when a new government comes in, and we'll soon talk about the 3 months before the election, is that they reorganize government entirely. How much attention should you try to pay to what people are saying a year before the election around how they want to organize government, the logistics of the thing?
Yeah, I mean, certainly my experience has been that tends to sort of happen closer to the time. So I think a year before, what people will be doing is they'll be painting the big picture. So if you imagine it as a picture, a year out from the election, you're doing the broad brushstrokes. You're saying, I'm going to paint this kind of landscape. And then as you get nearer and nearer to the election, you're filling in more and more of the detail. And some of the machinery of government stuff is really the final bits of detail that you're putting in there, because the electorates, are not focused on those machinery pieces. Actually, for us, for policy professionals, the machinery pieces are critical. We could go. It's like the divination experts, the diviners in ancient Rome that would look at the entrails of a freshly slaughtered bird. If you kind of look at the entrails of government, and you can see that, this little bit of a department has moved from here to there. If you look at the European Commission, how they've divided up these, where's the tech bit sitting in whose portfolio in the European Commission? That's really, really important for people like us. Obviously, for the public out there, these kind of things leave them cold, and they want this big picture. So we go from the landscape to maybe filling in, the creatures in the landscape as we get nearer to the election, to, if I could use that sort of description, the entrails of the creatures, which is the machinery of government. That's something that sort of gets filled in last minute.
I think we might have to call the metaphor police here because I'm not sure you see the entrails in the painting. But yes, I see your point. So let's move on to those 3 months before the election. I remember early on I was taught as I was learning policy craft that the core thing in that period is not to become an election issue. That's sort of the one thing you want to avoid. Is that good advice?
It is. I mean, what happens at election time is governments rather political parties at this stage are looking for commitments that will make them popular. They're looking for votes. That's what they do. And generally speaking, if you are in the frame, if there's something, I mean, it's typically going to be about bashing you. I guess there's one exception. If you've become an election issue because one of the parties has said, I'm going to champion industry X, and I'm going to champion these people, and then that would be fine. But invariably, that's not the case. It's that, if you elect me, I'm going to crack down on A or sort out B or regulate, so it's going to be something generally that where the politician has seen a political advantage in saying they're going to sort out some bit of the industry. So most of the time, you don't want to be in that frame. You don't want someone to be making a very public commitment that they're going to come after you. So if you can work with
even
them,
the champion issue, I mean, even the champion issue is somewhat tricky, right? Because if the side that actually wants to champion you loses with a landslide, then you're stuck in that particular framing and associated with it. So staying out of the more urgent, heated election issue debate is probably good advice to the extent you can. Sometimes, of course, you can.
I mean, if we look, we got this ongoing court case with TikTok in the United States at the moment, and that's sort of gone both ways, hasn't it? That at one stage, former President Trump was passing an executive order, effectively trying to kick TikTok out of the United States. That became, for him, a very political issue. Now, the political issue is he's championing TikTok against the Biden administration who are trying to restrict it. So it's, I'd say from a company point of view, that's not a great place to be, where action against you is seen as this political football, because you're right. Even if your supposed champion, even if one of them is a supposed champion of yours, the risk is that the other side wins. And in any case, you really don't want the fate of your business to be sort of tied up into these party political debates. It's not a great place.
And the other thing that, besides not becoming an election issue, you actually also want to step back from a lot of the engagements you're doing, because you want to have the election be a fairly clean process where you don't have to take sides. So if the year before is really intense, the 3 months before is a time for reflection for most policy teams, because engaging in an election or engaging with parties at that point is hard and probably not wise, right?
That's right. Yeah, I mean, in the UK system, there's actually a formal process called purdah, where the government goes into a period of purdah. It's not allowed to announce anything significant in the run up to an election, and the idea being that we need to keep that neutrality. Yes, the political parties go at each other, but other bits of government who are working as government shouldn't allow what they're doing to be seen as part of the partisan campaign. And I would say the same, certainly in the UK, I think applies to companies. Again, other cultures have a different approach. From the United States, companies will merrily give lots of money to political candidates and so on. But I think the European tradition is much more that if a company is seen as trying to put its thumb on the scale during the election period, either by giving money or by making announcements that favour one candidate or the other, most people, I think, see that very negatively.
I think there's bipartisan agreement that would be that's meddling where you don't belong.
It's meddling, yes. So if, for example, as a company, you want to, if you're an online company like the ones that we work for, that you might want to offer a platform to a party. In that case, you're generally expected to offer the platform to all parties. And then you run into issues about can you or should you include or exclude fringe parties, ones that are controversial in a country. And I think the safest option these days tends to be do nothing. Just avoid getting yourself dragged into the party politics. Is rarely going to do you a favour. It's a very low risk option, but it's certainly one I think over time, I think we're moving in that direction, getting involved particularly where you've got a broader range of parties that I'm trying to use the right adjective, but that some people love, but a lot of other people hate. It's very high risk then to say, look, we're going to go in neutrally and work with all parties, because by doing that, you're going to end up with some of that reputational attention being focused on you.
So it's the time to step back. And when you step back, there something interesting happens, even political parties 3 months before an election. And that is that we see the formation of what is in the US referred to as transition teams. So what are transition teams, and why can they be really important to sort of track and understand, even if you're stepping back and not engaging?
Yeah, in the US, obviously, because they have this long gap between the election in November and the administration taking over in January, then these transition teams are critical. They're the technocrats, effectively, the ones we were describing earlier, who are working for the elected politicians, but are more the policy experts within their party grouping, but often at a very technical level in any area, whether it's climate policy or tech policy or banking, whatever it is. So that group are the ones who would form in the US a formal transition team. European countries is very different. The UK, the Prime Minister is taken out of the door, on the day after the election, and an hour later the new one comes in. So there is no transition as such. It's instant. In other European countries, because of the need to form a coalition, it works slightly differently. Again, that on the day of the election, you don't know who's going to be in government. It might be, if it's Belgium, a period of several months. If it's, I know in Sweden how long it takes, but there's a period of time. And so it's not a formal transition team in the way it would be in the US, because you still don't know who's actually going to end up in government. Coalition is still being formed. And maybe that actually is probably something you've got more experience of than I have, Nicklas, that working where in a sense the election is sort of ongoing, isn't it? Even after polling day, because you've got this sort of shuffling around to see who ends up with the right portfolios. UK, I say that's done cleanly in the same day, and then you're going to work with whoever the technocrats are of the winning party.
Yes, I think the Swedish case is interesting because to some degree you always have to have a coalition. No party will reach the majority since it's not a majority system. And so what ends up happening is that you have these coalition transition teams that sit down and talk in a very circumspect way about, if you were to be minister, what would you like to be minister of? It's like sort of divvying up the different tasks, figuring out what structure, what are the first things they want to do. And these transition teams are made up often of former senior political officials. So not necessarily the technocrats, but somebody who is like an eminence grise, sorry for the French, somebody who's a great eminence and so has been in politics for a long while and has preferably some government experience, comes into this group, sits down, you talk through the logistics, what are we going to do, who is going to go where, how do we actually figure out the governance that we need to engage with. And those transition teams, I think, are interesting because they remain important throughout the government's life cycle. They put a mark early on the logistics and construction and architecture of government, and that mark will really, really matter. I think there's something like that in the UK in the sense that there are some senior statesmen who I think play a very large role in the formation of how a government thinks about things. So I think it's no secret, and it's been sort of widely reported that the Tony Blair Institute has played at least some of that role for the incoming Labour government, for example. And that I think is relevant for you to understand, observe, and learn from as a policy professional.
Yeah, I mean, what will happen in the UK often is some of the old folks will be sort of hired back into government, and then you will get some of the technocrats. So the Tony Blair Institute is interesting. That's a kind of hub of tech policy. And they were always interesting. I found a lot of their output interesting. They are extra interesting now that we have a Labour government because there's clearly a kind of, I think a reasonably, I find it a reasonably healthy revolving door between sort of Labour-friendly tech organisations, think tanks, etc., and a Labour government, just as the same way there would be one between Conservative-friendly think tanks and so on, and a Conservative government. So we have this those kind of institutes tend to be a recruiting ground for the kind of technocrats that the government will bring in the UK system. The system you described in Sweden actually is making me think a little bit. That's in a sense what happens with the European Commission as well. That is in that case, there's an election, but the election isn't for the commissioners. The election is for the parliament. But having elected the parliament, there's a kind of horse trading exercise goes on, and actually some of those MEPs then magically transmute, don't they, into commissioners as well. So I think that is much more closer to the model you described, the coalition formation post-election that's happening in the commission has just been, I think, nearly completed. I think there's one question mark over one commissioner, but it's pretty much complete now.
Slovenia hasn't been confirmed yet, I think. But so I think that's right. Well, although the commission process is a little bit more opaque, and it's harder to sort of find that particular coalition because there's so many national interests that go into the nomination of the commissioner. So you can understand the national dynamics that will produce the nomination for a commissioner. But then when it hits Brussels, it sort of is reflected back into the national context, and there's a bit of back and forth. And sometimes
so we're now in four-dimensional chess.
It's five-dimensional chess. And sometimes it can even lead to a country that has nominated one commissioner to withdraw their nomination and then nominate somebody else in dialogue. So those things happen very rarely, but they do happen.
Yes.
So, so the 3 months before, do not become an election issue. Have a sense of what the transition will look like and what ideas will propel it forward. And I think, crucially, also one of the things you can do is to ask yourself, if I could give one message to the incoming parliamentarians or the incoming ministers, something that I think would be interesting to them and would be interesting to me, what kind of message would that be? Because in the chaos when the new government actually comes into power, which we'll just transition into, there is going to be a lot of people who want to talk with them. So how do you do that?
Yeah, I think the messaging after is really important. And again, I would say the broad stance, if you're in a company, is try and be helpful. We've got a whole bunch of people coming in. And there are these different types of elections. There's continuity elections, where most of the people who have been elected are the same as the ones who were elected the previous time. And they're, I think, slightly different. There's less urgency. But when you have a big change, a sea change election, and there's lots of new people coming in, frankly, they're kind of struggling. What do they do? How do they organize themselves? What should they care about? It's a huge amount of new information coming in at once. And what they will remember is the people who were helpful to them. And so if you are, for example, in our sector, the tech sector, helping them to understand what's important in the tech sector, I think is really, really helpful. And I've seen smart companies do, education programs that are not, it's got to be very soft. It can't be, I am going to educate you as to why you should not regulate my company. It's not that. It's like genuinely open education programs saying this is how the sector works. This is the thing that you are now responsible for, that you're going to have to get your head around. And if you are capable of doing that in a very helpful, non-lobbying way, then I think that's perhaps the most useful thing you can do immediately after an election. The mistake, conversely, is to be straight in there and go, right, this is what I want, my shopping list. And that ain't going to work. Certainly not in the UK. I think, again, there may be other political cultures. And the US stands out as one where that relationship between companies and representatives is a little different. It may be that, there is more of this is what we committed to when I gave you that money in the run up to the election. There's a little bit of that, this is what we expected, and we're going to go in and we're going to ask you to deliver that. And I certainly have experienced a little bit sometimes of a culture clash between US companies and the European political culture, where sometimes American colleagues expect you to be much more like, it's a new government, go in and ask for A, B, and C. And I'd say that's, in my experience, a big mistake. You need to go in and say, how can I help you build the confidence, build the trust, become a trusted expert on something, and then you have permission to start suggesting things that you think would be in the national interest and that you think should be done.
And success, if you really do this well, is that you're perceived as a knowledge partner rather than a lobbyist. And I think to a large degree, people underestimate how important it is for companies in all sectors to just make sure that people have the baseline facts right and understand the industry at some deeper level. Because once that's done, 80% of your job is done. People think it's the other way around, that 20% is about knowing and 80% about convincing. But I think it's actually entirely the other way around. And to your point, being helpful means to be there for the questions that are asked and to answer them to the best of your ability. And that's why it's also usually quite good to work with third parties, think tanks, or trade associations or others, because they can then aggregate across a number of different companies the different views and viewpoints, etc., and provide knowledge in a way that is perceived to be more neutral. And that neutrality is quite legitimate to ask for. So to me, I think I really like the formulation. Try to be helpful. Sometimes you have to be helpful by proxy, but I do think that being helpful is absolutely essential. So we've looked at 1 year before, 3 months before. Now it's the day after the election, and we've said that you should try to be as helpful as you can. Now let's see what happens 3 months after the elections. Things will have stabilized a bit. Is this where you sort of power back your campaigns? How do you start to think about how do you give people 100 days, or do you give them a little bit more or less?
Yeah, I mean, I think in most cases they will be setting again the broad agenda over those 100 days. So that's the moment, and actually, from a very practical point of view, the legislative agenda will be set, and we sometimes forget this sort of just very basic administrative task that any legislature, whether that's the European system, the EU system, or a national legislature, any legislature has a limited capacity to pass legislation. And they will set that program out. And that program they have to set out quite early because they've then got to get people drafting the legislation, working on it. And so you can miss the boat. If you don't get in there early, you miss the boat. And the next sort of opening for legislation may be a year or two down the track. So the legislative piece is quite important to get that sorted out early and make sure that you understand what's happening and what the priorities are. Now, I think the other piece that we sometimes miss, because the elections and the politics is obviously the big thing. It's the big thing in the news. It's what everyone's talking about. But the day-to-day administration carries on. And a lot of the regulatory work is just going to carry on through an election. And so I think, again, from a public policy team's point of view, it's important that you keep everything in perspective. Yes, you want to spend a lot more time with the new politicians. But no, you don't want to neglect the stuff that's just going to carry on business as usual. And that's going to be a big chunk of what's happening. And there is a risk you go running off after the shiny object, new politicians. You fail to persuade them to take up your big initiative because there isn't room in the program. And then you find that you've lost your momentum in the day-to-day agendas that you were working on prior to the election because you've had your eye off the ball. So that's, again, I think a trap to avoid is one that could happen during election periods.
I like that very much. I think it's true. Business as usual is underestimated. And I think business as usual is what makes the world go round. So to a large degree, that's going to be something that you do throughout, whether there are elections or not. Now, we have walked through the 3 month, the 1 year ahead, the 3 months ahead, the election day, after the election. And is there anything that people should really be aware of when it comes to an election that we haven't spoken about? Something that most people miss, but if you really get it right, it can be super helpful.
Yeah, I actually think spending time looking at the individuals, because politics is a collective and an individual endeavor. And so looking at the individuals who are coming in, particularly the new ones coming into the political scene or the ones who are growing, there may be people that are not front and center for the campaign, but they first pop up at an election and they're going to be really interesting in 10 years' time. And so understanding that, and they'll come through various categories. They might be working in a think tank first, then they go to elected office, and they leave elected office and go into the administration. But the individuals who are really passionate about your subject and understand it, and are going to be passionate and understand it for 10 or 20 years, elections are really good time to see them, identify them, and understand how you intend to work with them. Some of them may end up as your colleagues in the tech sector because they may go also through a business phase as well. So I think that's something that we shouldn't underestimate at election time. It's a chance to see who is interested in what, who is self-selecting to champion particular causes, and understand the ones who are really interested in what you're interested in.
So summing that up, it's not just about the issues, it's much more about the people, because the people will be there in various roles afterwards too. And that brings me to another point that I think is important, that I personally think is something that people sometimes undervalue. And that is your relationship with the losing party in an election is even more important after the election than it was before the election, because the losing party will remember much more that you actually kept a very normal human relationship with people, even though they're currently not in power. And that matters a lot, I think. And it matters for like common decency too, I think.
It does. It's really important. I mean, being, for a politician, being gracious in defeat is really important. And if a politician is gracious in defeat, then that should be respected, and the people who are engaging with the politicians should continue to show an interest in them. It's not all or nothing. I think it's only in party politics you have this insane fiction that says everybody in my party is a genius and everybody in the other party is an idiot. And the reality is there are really good people in your party. There are usually some not very good people in your party, and the same applies to the other party. And again, I think as a policy professional, we shouldn't fall into that black and white trap. We should be thinking, who are the individuals across the parties who are really interested in what we're interested in? And we shouldn't, put all our attention on the winning party. I don't think, as you described, I don't think it's particularly ethical or gracious for a company to do that. It's also not smart in terms of your long-term interest. Yes. An individual who's really interested in your issues, who is now in opposition, could end up being much more noisy and influential because they're now free. I mean, opposition members are free from the constraints of government. They could end up, being much more engaged in the debate than they were on the government side. And so to miss that opportunity because all you can do is focus on the winners, I think would be a mistake.
Yes, it's a good reminder that public policy is an infinite game, not a finite game. I think that's key. And with those words, a long game it is. And with those words, thank you very much for listening. And we hope that we'll have you back next week. Take care.